Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Declaring that India prioritizes to deepen ties with African nations, Vice President Venkaiah Naidu, accompanied by a high-level delegation, kick-started his tour to Comoros and Sierra Leone last week. Mr. Naidu asserted that 32 outgoing visits of the President, the Prime Minister and the Vice President in the past 5 years and India's decision to open 18 new embassies in Africa are evident of the fact that Africa is considered as a focus continent by the Indian government. In his first engagement in Comoros, the Vice President addressed the Indian diaspora and urged them to join in writing New India's growth story with 3 other Ds: democracy, demand and demographic dividend. Meanwhile, India and Sierra Leone signed 6 agreements on Sunday to expand the bilateral relations in various fields and also agreed to push for UNSC reforms so that 1/3 of mankind residing in Africa and India occupy their rightful place in decision-making bodies of the UN. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze India's engagement with the African continent. Joining me on the program today are Anil Trigunayath, former ambassador, KP Nair, strategic analyst, and Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India as well. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. How would you look at the visit of the Vice President to both these African countries and of what importance is it?
Well, the good thing is that this Vice President has been going to Africa and several visits he's undertaken. And this is in accordance with the government's policy of deeply engaging with Africa, which has been, at least the high-level interaction has been missing from our side for decades. And now in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen more than 38, 37 visits at the level of President, Vice President and Prime Minister happening to the region, and which is extremely important. And as we know, Africa is one of the most important regions for the world, and in my view, in the second half of this century, you will see an Afro-Asian century emerging, not only Asian century, but merging into the African. And that is the place where the real action is going to be. And therefore, it is extremely important, and it is in this context that I see the Vice President's visit to Comoros and Sierra Leone. There were never any visit to Comoros Island. It is the first ever visit at a high level by any Indian dignitaries, and the kind of agreements that we have signed with them. It's a poor country, a small country with a small trade possibilities, but it's a very strategic location in the Indian Ocean. It used to fall on the trade routes at one time. It was very strong. It has a tremendous flora and fauna. But at the same time, the 3 islands that comprise Comoros now, but the 4th one which is still continuing to be with the French, they are very, very strategic from our point of view. And that is the reason that I think, apart from other MOUs on Foreign Office consultations, CEP and all that, we have signed a defense cooperation MOU with them, agreement, and under which we are also going to supply them a couple of high-speed boats. We are giving them some more money to buy about 10 high-speed boats. So defense and in the Indian Ocean region, and IORA India is paying their contribution actually. So that is a strategic point of, in my view, of this Comoros visit, very, very significant. As far as Sierra Leone is concerned, we have been involved with them in stabilizing the country. Our forces were there under the aegis of the United Nations, UNSC, and we have been stationing about 40,000 odd forces were there, and we have done remarkably well. Again, this was the area where we had not done much, and both are the Francophone countries, and this why we need to. Now, in my view, I also look at it from another point of view, is that the French, who still hold a very close relationship with these countries, and India and France are now coming closer, and therefore there is a greater possibility of entering into that strategic domain with these countries. So I believe that there is a new beginning of our relationship with these countries, and most of the African countries until 3 years ago have been always complaining that there are no high-level visits from India. People used to go to South Africa and that's it. Right. And that has changed, and that is remarkable in that context. Only thing is, whatever lines of credits we announce, whatever aid we announce, like in this case we have given to both of them 1,000 metric tons of rice and all, this should be delivered immediately. Right. The delivery mechanisms should improve very quickly. Sure. And that's very important.
Sure. I'm going to take the point that the ambassador made about South Africa forward with you, Mr. Nair. When we look at the African continent as a whole, historically, the ties have been, focused around South Africa, be it BRICS or be it any of the multilateral forums where India and South Africa have come together. But over the last 5 or 6 years, you've noticed that we started engaging with smaller countries as well. How important is that?
I'm glad you asked this question because this has been a problem. Either we go to East Africa, where there is a large concentration of Indian origin people, or South Africa because of the traditional links that we've had even during the apartheid years with the African National Congress and the Indian community, Gandhiji's presence there and all that. I'm glad, I said I'm glad because one thing that has not been noted amidst all the visits that are taking place is that very quietly but hopefully very effectively the Narendra Modi government has launched an Atlantic African initiative, you see. Like the President Ramnath Kovind made 10 visits to Africa in his tenure. 4 of these have been to countries on the Atlantic coast of Africa, you see. We've traditionally concentrated on the other side and generally neglected the Atlantic coast. The Vice President also has been concentrating on countries that we have not paid attention to. You see, the problem is that our Indo-Pacific initiative gets a lot of attention because countries in the Pacific are better known, they have a better image, but intrinsically I think the Atlantic African initiative of the government deserves a lot of praise because these are countries which are in some ways difficult to deal with in the sense of functioning there or setting up things there and all that. But these are also countries which have tremendous resources that have been less exploited than African countries on in the rest of the continent. So it is a very good initiative that this government has undertaken in concentrating on countries other than the better known ones like South Africa, as you mentioned.
Kenya, Zimbabwe.
Yes, and the Vice President's current visit, ongoing visit, for instance, Sierra Leone, Sierra Leone is so rich in resources. Sierra Leone, there have been controversies about diamonds and all that, but we need to put our best foot forward, and Comoros again, it has been neglected in Indian diplomacy. So this, I would say, is an initiative that can bring rich returns if, as I always say on your programs, if there is follow-up. Our main problem is follow-up, and I hope these visits will be followed up, high-level visits will be followed up by concrete action on the ground.
Right. So, Professor Pant, as is being pointed out by both the panelists, of course, we need follow-up and we also need timely delivery as far as, engaging with nations in Africa or anywhere else in the world is concerned. We'll put that aside and we'll talk about the strategic importance of Comoros now, because let's not forget this government has focused a lot on the Indian Ocean as well. And since it's an island nation close to Somalia where piracy and all of that happens as well, how important is it to have strategic ties with nations like Comoros and others in the region?
Well, I think it's very important, and I think when Prime Minister laid out his Indo-Pacific vision at the Shangri-La, and when he talked of the expanse that India's Indo-Pacific vision covers, the Indian Ocean and the littoral assumes an importance that I think it deserves in India's strategic mapping. And so you have these small island states which we are now beginning to take relatively more seriously than in the past, and I think that's a good sign in terms of whether we want to expand our footprint in that part of the world, whether we look at Indian Ocean as a very important strategic component of our larger Indo-Pacific strategy, or whether we look at the great power geopolitical contestation that is going on and how effectively other countries, some of the other major powers, in particular China, has been successful in bringing some of the smaller nations into their scheme of things. So I think if you look at Comoros, if you look at how it has been relatively neglected in the Indian scheme of things, perhaps it's all very well now that we are beginning to look at its role in the larger framework of our Indian Ocean strategy and in the larger framework of our Indo-Pacific strategy. So clearly you have these smaller island states, and we have traditionally focused on countries like Mauritius and Madagascar, which are where we have Indian diaspora, for example, and it's only now that we are beginning to see a more strategic context to these engagements, and therefore having a solid partner in many of these countries would give India the kind of footprint in the region that perhaps it wants, and therefore it seems to me that this can become a very important instrument in the way we shape going forward our larger maritime strategy in that part of the world. And of course it then dovetails very well and with the larger African strategy that India has evolved. And I think a point that has been made earlier is that one of the complaints that you always used to hear is that India's engagement is episodic in nature. It comes and then it goes, and now that we have had sustained interaction, or at least there is a policy of having sustained interaction at high levels, it not only sends a signal to Africa, to the larger littoral states, that we continue to be involved, but also I think it does some good to your credibility as an actor, that as you're rising, as you claim that you have geopolitical interests in various parts of the world, you need to be engaged at the very high level, and that's what I think Vice President visits and the previous visits, which have been very frequent now, underscore.
Okay, all right. Taking the discussion forward now, Ambassador Naidu, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor was launched in 2017. I think it was in May in Gujarat, yes, if I'm not wrong. So, how can we take that forward? Ensure that we take it up to the next level, take it up a notch.
You see, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor essentially was between Japan and India mainly, to benefit the Africans to a great extent and to do things that can be done more effectively and efficiently. And Japan has been the largest ODA donor to the African countries and to the world essentially. Now they have been doing various projects. Problem has been that we have not been able to identify in a great way which are the projects where we are going to work closely. There have been some working groups, but I'm yet to see something very concrete that has been launched. Of course, something in Kenya we are doing. They are looking at some kind of corridors, some major projects, but nothing has really moved. And they think that the Japanese think that the Indians have a tremendous goodwill in the country, in the continent of Africa. So the problem is, I think we have to attune the working styles of Japanese with the Indian working ways, and also the technical expertise. And I think that the best way forward is to identify across the continent some of the key projects that are low-hanging, that can be jointly done and could provide joint benefit. At the same time, as you know, that all these projects also are to accrue some kind of influence, political influence in the country. So are you looking at it neutralizing the Chinese influence there? Now, as you know, China has been advancing very fast into Africa, and they have almost every corner of Africa they're already present, and they are reaping the benefits of it also, because if in the last meeting of the FOCAC, if you know that when the Americans criticized them, it was the African leaders who rose to criticize the Americans, the British, the French, the colonial powers who had decimated them to this level of poverty. So therefore, it is, I believe that in this Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, at least I am not aware in the public domain that very significant movement has taken place. There have been some meetings, there are some groups, there are one or two projects also, but much more could be done, because Japanese are allocating a lot of funds, India is allocating a lot of lines of credits and the funds. Now again, the delivery mechanism, the timely delivery is extremely important in this also. And they need to identify the right kind of projects that are in consultation with the Africans. That's extremely important.
Right.
Yes.
It has to be sustainable for both India, Japan and Africa on the whole. Yeah, so that having been said, Mr. Nair, what is the potential of the ties between India and the African continent? What are the areas that we need to focus on?
Traditionally, India has concentrated on African freedom. Our contribution to the liberation struggles and decolonization have been very, very significant, and it has been appreciated. But the stage has come when we need to look beyond that, you see. African countries are changing very rapidly, both politically and in other ways. And while the past is important, Gandhiji's contribution to South Africa is very important. India's contribution to the liberation struggles has been very important, but African countries have started looking ahead, you know. So it's very good that lately we have stopped, we are talking less about the past and concentrating on the future. We need to build a new kind of goodwill so that we can get the benefits from them, from that. And I would say that we are on the right track, but we need to persevere. You see, for example, when former President APJ Abdul Kalam addressed the Pan-African Parliament in 2004, he unveiled this big vision of telemedicine for Africa. And I am very happy to say in this case that there was follow-up, and in 2011 we launched the Pan-African e-network from the towers of Telecommunications India Limited, TCIL, here in Delhi, and now it reaches 48 countries, you know, and it's remarkable what we have done. I mean, I came across one example in Senegal, a 14-year-old child who had brain disorder, and the Senegal government was willing to send the boy to Europe for surgery, but no airline, no Western airline was willing to fly him because of his condition to Europe. And then this e-network that we have, it was used, and doctors from a hospital in Delhi were connected on that e-network, and the surgery was done by doctors in Dakar with minute assistance through the screen from doctors in the hospital here, you see. And just imagine how much goodwill it brings, you see. I mean, in Seychelles, for instance, a lot of people don't realize Seychelles is a very rich country. It sends, it used to send all its serious patients to Europe. Now 70% of patients in Seychelles are treated through the Pan-African e-network. So we have created a lot of goodwill, but we need to transform. Well, it's perhaps the wrong word to use, that we should monetize it, you see, but we need to somehow transform this goodwill into concrete gains, you see. And in the previous government, I remember the then Commerce Minister Suresh Prabhu had this idea of cooperating with the UAE and Saudi Arabia in order to do commercial relations with Africa. You see, the UAE people are, Dubai and Abu Dhabi are very good at this sort of thing, you see. I mean, they have that entrepreneurial spirit and seafaring spirit on commercial lines, which harnessed with India's resources, it can build a thriving commercial link with Africa, three-way commercial link, which I am sure can in many ways rival what China is doing with its huge resources and all. This is one example of what lies ahead, what we can do.
Sure. Talking about China, Professor, how can we compete with China, and can we or should we compete with China in Africa?
Well, I think it would be a non-starter to think in terms of competition with China, because China is already very far ahead in terms of the resources it has and in terms of the kind of political profile, diplomatic profile that it has gained in the region. But I think where India stands with tremendous advantages is that India still is seen as a country that looks at Africa as a partner, and I think that's where the normative sort of shift that India brings to the table is very important. India's relationship with Africa remains demand driven. It remains a partnership approach to African questions. And I think a lot of what China has done in the recent years has created some backlash against Chinese investments, against Chinese behavior, against Chinese pattern of engaging Africa. And that opens up some space for India, where India can offer up an alternative vision of economic engagement, and that is what India precisely has done. And I think Mr. Nair was talking of a very forward-looking partnership, and I think if you recall Mr. Modi's speech, the 10 guiding principles that he has laid out, they are very, very actually very clever in terms of the way they articulate India's position, and very evocatively bring out what India needs to do in Africa, which is all about bottom-up approach to policy making with the great involvement of Africans themselves. What they require, India should be willing to provide them in a sustainable manner, in a manner that that allows them to march into the 21st century with all the skills that they need to become the front-ranking continent in the world. So I think there is that element now that is well understood in India, that without actually entering into competition with China, there is a lot that India can do in partnership with African countries, and I think that's what India is striving to do. The other thing I think which is important, and which you touched upon earlier, is this approach to trilateral engagement. So you have now the Japan has been talked about as a partner. You also have UAE and Saudis have been talked of as a partner. Europe has become involved in Africa in a significant way. You can look at the littoral states in Africa, where France is such an important actor. And look at that partnership. So I think increasingly, because you cannot compete with the Chinese dollar to dollar, you need partnership with other countries to make your policies in Africa sustainable. And I think that's the approach that I see building up in the Indian policy making towards Africa in the last few years.
Right, all right. Time now to get closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward as far as India and Africa are concerned, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, as was mentioned, that the Prime Minister's 10 guiding principles which he laid out at Kampala, if we follow those and develop our delivery mechanisms very efficiently and harness the goodwill that exists there, we are in for it as a reliable and a trusted partner of Africa.
All right, Mr. Nair.
In conclusion, I would like to pose a question. Well, how many of our viewers know of a country called Eswatini? I'm sure many of the viewers will not know. It is the old Swaziland, you see. The king of the Swazi king changed the name of the country on his 50th birthday, because one of the reasons he said was that people were getting confused with Switzerland, you know. So the reason why I say this is, only very recently Swaziland became Eswatini, but we have been there. Our president went there, I think last year or last year, yes. And Ambassador Anil Trigunayat will remember how we got involved from his time in Moscow. He will remember how we got involved in the former Soviet countries. You see, we were among the first to get there. The Americans were also there, but they made a lot of mistakes that we did not make. So we have this drive to go even to a country like Swaziland at a critical time when that country was changing. So the will is there, and we need to push that. We need to push that very actively and vigorously in order to strengthen our connections with Africa.
Right. And Professor, close the show for us with your conclusion.
Well, I think we need to make this partnership in real sense of the term a forward-looking 21st century partnership, and I think two areas are critical: education, skill development, where India and Africa have very similar needs, and I think India can offer a lot. The other is, I think, Indian corporate sector needs to become a bit more risk-taking. I think we are the Indian corporate sector is too risk-averse. And that's where China has had such a big advantage in terms of where they have gone and where they've set up shop. I know there are differences in the way the economies operate, but still I think Indian private sector can do much more than it is doing today.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that we need to ensure that we follow up on the high-level visits that India takes in Africa, and also timely delivery of the projects and the MOUs that are signed there is very important, is what the panelists are suggesting. And there is tremendous goodwill for India in Africa, but it is now time to turn that goodwill into mutual gains. That's it from me. See you again next time.